everybody.
Where would you like me?
I'll follow you wherever you want to go. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I don't really think that Dave needs an introduction, but Dave Klumb has been building sleds for over 40 years, and last count was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 sleds.
Yep.
And tonight he's going to give us a little lecture on dog sleds from whalebone to carbon fiber. Thank you, Dave.
Hi, as everybody probably knows, my name is Dave, and I build dog sleds. And that sounds like the start of a 12-step program, and it partly is. I really like building sleds. And she's correct. At this point in time, I'm somewhere, I haven't actually done an official count recently, but somewhere 2,500, probably give or take, a little bit over now. Frank Hall from Michigan built a little over 5,000 in his life, so I don't think I'll make that yet, because I've been doing this for a long time. And when I was setting this up, the reason I use the term whalebone to carbon fiber is to kind of cover that, pretty much covers everything in the evolution of the dog sled. And people think I might have a prejudice towards one type of material over another, but I must admit that every material that has come along that dog sleds have been made out of has been the best material at the time that people have been able to use. The thing about dog sleds you've got to remember is this used to not be an industry. This used to be a skill that individuals would have. So they weren't producing these on a mass scale. These were something that were done individually and evolved over time. And the materials that these people had were the materials at hand. If you were up on the northwest coast of Alaska, you just weren't going to run down to the Home Depot, get yourself some oak or hickory or ash and turn it into a dog sled. So it used to be up here, say, coming out of the mid-century, the sleds that say came out of the 40s, 50s, 60s, you could almost nail down the location of where those sleds were made in the state, just based on the materials that went into the sleds. The areas that had a lot of caribou, you saw caribou babiche. Areas that had moose, you had moose babiche. You had sealskin up on the coast. You had whalebone. On the coast especially, you see a lot of driftwood because they didn't have any wood, so you would find driftwood sleds. So whatever materials they had on hand, probably go to the most exotic, and Joanne reminded me of this the other day. If any of you have ever read Peter Freuchen's works, My Life with the Eskimos, and in the Greenland, Eskimos used to actually make sleds out of fish. And that way they had transportation and food at the same time. Now, I think we can all understand when something goes wrong here. And there were several cases where indeed the dogs got to the sleds, ate the sleds, and everybody died. That was pretty much the end of the story. So sleds have been around for obviously a long time. And again, it doesn't matter if you have a sled that's tied with babiche or you've got the latest Euro design, rolling off with nothing but carbon fiber and high-tech plastic. It doesn't matter. You've got to make sure that when you start down the trail, that sled is in its best running shape as you can make it, and have a familiarity with that sled, that if something happens to it, that you can fix it. Now, I understand if you're a sprint musher and you're running a pretty short run, that's not necessarily an issue. If you're on the Yukon River and something goes wrong and you're in between checkpoints, you're screwed. If you don't know how to fix that sled. And the problem I have with some of the new high-tech sleds is I'm one of these people who's always gone with the KISS principle, because the simpler things are, the easier they are to replace. And just saying, I can break a mortise and tenon joint, get some willow and some nylon, and I can get that sled back on the trail. I rip a ball joint out. That suddenly turns into a whole different animal out there. You're not going to get that ball joint back in there, trust me, not easily. The same with carbon fiber. When carbon fiber kind of came out into the mushing world, everybody thought, along with aluminum runners, man, we are going to have sleds that are never going to break again. In fact, one company, and I can't remember the name, actually marketed a unbreakable sled. Lance Mackey brought 2 of them over for me to fix. So we had a good laugh over this. And the thing is that, again, people who aren't building sleds in Alaska, and I'm not trying to put myself on a pedestal or anything here, but you don't fully appreciate the conditions that we go through sometimes on dog sleds from the people outside. A lot of their trails are really big and wide, and where a lot of our trails, if you stick your elbows out, you're going to break them both. It's a whole different dynamic dealing with sleds. So over the years, I've seen some incredible things, come through, especially in distance sleds, because let's face it, folks, the big move is how light can we make these things that we drive down the trail. It sounds good on paper, but again, you need a little bit of weight to hold you down on the trail. It's a dog sled, it's not a rocket ship. Ask some people going down Denzel Gorge on really light sleds in really icy conditions. It's like, Lord, please give me 20 extra pounds in my basket. Help me hold down on this thing. So when you head out with this sled, even if it's on a training run, and I've been guilty of this myself, you should always kind of take a look, give it that cursory look over. Like I said, I'm not taking a moral high ground here. I've been on the trail, I've looked down, got my foot on the brake, and there's no nut on that brake pin down there. That's not going to last very long, is it? Things like that. I did bring a couple of props to just pass around to give people an idea. A lot of our sleds are bolt together now rather than tied. And one of the big trends in cutting weight is to take a standard nylon lock nut. And you'll notice how the profile on these, you can pass some of these around, and they're replacing them with low profile nylon lock nuts. Again, which sounds really good on paper. You're cutting tenths of grams here to make up ounces. But what happens is you've got very little thread here actually engaged on the end of your bolts. And any loosening of this, it's gone. And the thing about bolt together sleds is they don't like to lose bolts. Somehow they just don't run when the bolts aren't in them. So pass these around, you can kind of take a look at what I'm talking about there. And it's the little things like this that cause people big problems on sleds. It's usually not the big stuff. Most of the damage that I see coming into the shop on broken sleds is what I call secondary damage. There's been a problem that has been ignored, and because they've ignored that problem, something happened to make that sled not drive properly or break in another area. An engineer, at some point in time, I built a lot of tour sleds, and these things are massive in the sled world. These babies are 2 feet wide. Some have been 30 inches wide. Yep, man. And they're like 9, 10-foot beds in them. Some have seats, some have 2 seats. When I started building tour sleds and talking to people who really hauled weight, and we as mushers need to just back up, as we say, and think about this for a minute. Most of us here don't really move weight anymore as mushers. That used to be a much more of a pastime as a lifestyle up here. So when people started talking to me about tour sleds and moving weight, I talked at that time to some of the people who were moving weight, Will Forsberg, Jeff and Laura Yanucci down in Denali, who were sledding things up to the 4,000-foot level of Denali in the spring. Julie and Mickey Collins out of Minchumina, people who are actually loading 55-gallon drums of fuel, things like that, into sleds. So we started talking in terms of 500, 600, 700 pounds. These tour sleds, you're pushing 1,000, 1,200 pounds. When Linwood and Sebastian started giving me the weight numbers on these things, it was like, are you kidding? Folks haven't moved this kind of stuff since maybe the turn of the century. So next time you see these tourists, really appreciate what these folks are hauling down the trail. And the thing I always tell people about tourists is it's not like freight. You can't strap these things in. You know, they're kind of free flowing, and that's tough. Because like on the glaciers, we're talking about some of these individuals moving into that 300-400 pound range. That's a lot of freight not to have strapped down. And yeah, it's just heck on runners, and that's a nice word to use. For my standard tour sleds, I'm building a 7 laminate, 2-inch thick white ash runner. And they're tough. But like the engineer said, Dave, at some point in time, things have got to break. So if you're breaking grade 8 bolts, that means maybe the runners will last a little bit longer. But we snapped 5/16 and 1/4 inch grade 8 bolts like popcorn. Seriously, on these things. Just because no matter what you do, you put that much weight in a sled, and as it undulates down the trail, things just bad happen to it. So that's kind of one of the new aspects that's been a little bit bizarre in the sled building world. I mean, these things are land boats. Handles, that is how we finally have solved the holding the people in. On my big sleds, we have handles in the front, and then the people behind actually have another handle to hold on to. We tried side handles, and that broke some people's fingers, so that didn't work. This has been a very long evolutionary process and a lot of missteps along the way, which I'm happy to say is a good thing in sled building, because you just can never feel secure in everything you have. Another word about carbon fiber, because again, that's real popular. Think of hockey sticks. They break them all the time. Essentially, a lot of people use carbon fiber hockey sticks for stanchions. They work really good, but here's the secret. What you need to do is wherever you put a bolt through there, you need to put something inside that tube to give it some solidity. Because what I've seen, particularly in some of the sprint sleds, is there's nothing there. And carbon fiber breaks and carbon fiber unwinds. And it's not like wood. It's not like you can just go out there, grab a stick, wrap some stuff around it or some Gorilla Tape and head on down the trail. Carbon fiber doesn't like to break. And once it breaks, it just keeps breaking. So pay attention to what, when you buy some of these new sleds, ask the manufacturer, is there something solid where that bolt goes through into the stanchion? If not, you might want to think twice about it. There's another thing that has come up with the sleds, and this has pretty much come out of, again, the sprint mushing world and the European sled building world. The Europeans just love high tech. And I take my hat off to them. I send footboards and things to them, and we do communicate. But it's like they have this different idea about driving a sled. There's a difference between driving a sled and riding a sled. And if you've ever been on a sled for 1,000 miles, you know the difference. If you get to ride a sled, you could be going down the trail, maybe one hand, eating cookies, drinking coffee. If you've got to drive that sled, your hands are on that handle all the time while you're driving that sled down the Yukon River. And you get so tired of driving the sled. I remember Mike Ellis coming to the shop after a quest and saying that. He had an outlaw sled, and he said, I had to drive that damn thing all the way to Whitehorse. It was no fun. So think about this when you are doing long trips. How comfortable are you going to be on that trip? A sled is not necessarily going to win you a race. A sled's whole job is just to get you there and get you back. There was a native guy down on the Seward Peninsula who every year loved to call me up. It was after the Iditarod. They had some little 120 mile race down there. A lot of Iditaroders would go down there. And he'd talk about how he could smoke these guys. He was driving one of my old 5-foot standard toboggans, which is a brick. And the point is it's the dogs. I think we've got to remember, folks, it's the dogs that's the important thing out there. The sled is just this thing that we're kind of riding on. And, you've got to have that knowledge. You don't buy a brand new dog sled, pack it up, and then go out on the Iditarod the next day without knowing how that sled's going to react in different kinds of weather and different kinds of conditions. Been around this business a long time. And people ask me who your favorite or best, or, who's on your Mount Rushmore kind of mushers. And I kind of look at it through a different lens because, again, I'm looking at it through the sled lens. A lot of the things that we're driving now that's important to us, people like Jeff King, Rick Swenson, Martin Boozer, these were people who were building the early Iditarod sleds and things. And we can certainly go back to those people and give them a lot of credit. But there is nobody who starts the Iditarod, nobody who starts the quest, who doesn't owe a gift to Charlie Bowling. Because, folks, Charlie Bowling is the guy who, when you see the long stanchions going out to the front of the sled, no rear stanchions back here, that came from Charlie. Because you kind of have to understand Charlie. Charlie was out training for the quest, had this big sled, broke a rear stanchion, and the sled was handling very bad. So Charlie, being Charlie, instead of stopping and fixing the broken stanchion, he purposely broke the other stanchion. You got to understand Charlie, you know? And he discovered the sled just drove wonderful. So for about 2 seasons, he'd show up at Cold Spot with these really strange things on top of his truck. And it's like, Charlie, what the heck are you doing? And essentially, he figured out some basic physics. When you load that sled up and you need to move the weight in your sled, which should be right in front of you, you don't really need to be attached to it. That's going down the trail fine. All your steering needs to happen up there at the front of the sled. So that's why he moved all that steering stuff out to the front of the sled, cut those stanchions off of the back. Now that cargo just goes right down the trail with us now, and there's no problem there. And you've got that nice steering, and we've even figured out how high up on the arc we can go, how much vibration comes through those metal runners. Yes, folks, that's something else about metal runners. It transmits a lot of vibration more than other sleds do. So yeah, carpal tunnel syndrome, here you all come. So, Charlie kind of came up with that, and then everybody kind of took the same basic design and has run with it since. But he was the first one who really came up with that design, and that has probably been the biggest change in sled design in the last 1,000 years. I mean, seriously, you can go back. I've always said I can build a big wooden sled, drop it off 1,000 years ago, and people would figure out immediately how to use that sled. It's basically been stanchions, runners, and as a side note, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Hawaii, or Southern Alaska as we call it. We were on the Big Island in a place called the Place of Refuge, and it's a national park down there. We were going kind of through the museum, and I'm looking at this thing hanging on the ceiling, and it's like, pair of runners, cross pieces, what is this thing? When you're a king, you can do anything. They don't have snow there, so he would get people to go out and lay palm leaves down these chutes that they cleaned out down the side of the mountain. And the king would lay down on this sled and sled down the mountain. Sleds are universal. So I had brought some pictures, but I don't think we can see them. I can kind of pantomime things out. Like I said, I built a lot of sleds. One that I'm really kind of proud of, I'm proud of a lot of them, but I got a call from a movie company at one point in time, and they were doing a movie called Call of the Wild with Harrison Ford. And they needed a sled from the late 1800s, and I built them one. And it turned out really neat, I got to admit. I don't often like to pat myself on the head, but man, that baby really turned out sharp. I've never seen the movie. I showed a picture to people, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've seen the sled of the movie." So I'll get around to it one of these days. But just as kind of a side note, the movie was started by Fox, and the people I dealt with at Fox Studios were absolutely professional and really good and really understood. We were sending pictures back from the period, and we really nailed down a design that they wanted. Wrong file. Let's try.
These are cute though.
Yes, this is called Cabin Winter.
So remember, I'm working from a projector, not a computer.
Okay.
So
There's a file there called.
there's only one file on this drawing. But I don't have it. Is it? Did you have more in there?
Yeah, I did. I sent a thing over to it called Sleds.
I wonder if it went in there. So
Try
let's-
that. Let's see. Or anyways.
Let's see if it's hiding.
Anyways, halfway through the production, I sent the sled down there. Halfway through the production, Disney bought out Fox. And they called me up and they needed more sleds. They wanted like 3 more sleds. And long story short, instead of dealing with intelligent people, I was like dealing with a bunch of grade schoolers. And they sent me this design that they had for these sleds. And folks, let's just say I've never seen a dog sled like that in my life, and I've seen them all. And I wrote them this very long message about not only are these not even period inappropriate, they're just inappropriate, period. There was never a dog sled ever built like this, I mean, just for practical reasons. So anyways, it didn't go well. And finally I said, if you really want these built, I'm sure you've got a shop down there, somebody can build them. I wouldn't touch those with a 10-foot pole. Well, that's really disappointing, dude.
Yeah, it's not in here. Cool pictures.
Yeah, nice pictures, but, my foot. I did give you the right drive, yeah, okay. Joanne and I gave a talk on the Middle Fork of the Koyukuk kayaking earlier today, so we've been kind of stretched out on group talks today. That was at noon. Nothing, huh?
No,
Got the
wrong file. Loaded the wrong file.
Well, I had a hard time earlier, folks, and I'm about as technical as you can get. Anyways, I had emailed myself an album of pictures, dog sled pictures, and I had put it on this drive. I actually had read it on this drive.
It looks like someone brought a sled that's out on the deck.
Oh, we have one of your sleds with us.
Oh, well, thank you.
I have your kick sled in the car.
So, any questions? We're only burned up half an hour. Yes, Dick.
Okay, sort of a technical question for you. At what point have you found the ratio of runner wood thickness and layers in said runner to sort of equalize such that, okay, it's frivolous to put more layers than that. It's also frivolous to make the runner thicker than that or have simultaneously less layers because that would weaken the power of the runner.
Good question. And that really comes up especially in things like sprint sleds, where you've got, in the length of a runner, very often you have different thicknesses, and you've got that curve in there too. So I've seen them go down to about 3/32 of a layer of wood. And then I've not seen much thinner than that. And then to build up from that, what it does is the thinner the layers and the more of them will give you a springier runner. As your laminates get thicker, the spring goes out and those runners tighten up more. So the other thing is, what else are you going to do with those runners? Are you going to, for instance, add any fiberglass or carbon fiber?
carbon fiber covering is not that hard to put on small runners, and it adds a lot of stability. So you can get away with a thinner runner. But I would say on the high end, it gets hard to bend anything thicker than 5/16, and you start to get a certain amount more spring back when you take the runner off of the form. But I would say in the old days, in the classic days, most of your runners were about 1.25 inches wide and ranged from about 1 inch to 1.5 inches high. And so, say you were using 1/8 inch, laminates on that. Again, the big thing there is having the kind of form to bend that runner on, to get the consistency of it. Just want to throw out again, some people have recently expressed their frustration about steaming runners. Steaming wood is wonderful and it's fun, and I've done a lot of it. Folks, it's the 21st century, okay? We've moved on beyond steaming wood. There's not a lot romantic about steaming wood in the real big picture, because you have a hard time getting a consistency of curve in your runner. And also you learn, like I did early on in business, when I took apart a sled one day and laid the runners aside, and it was a particularly humid day. And when I got back to the runners, they were no longer runners. They were just 2 long boards sitting on the bench. They had laid flat back down. That's kind of a bad feeling sometimes, especially when it's not your sled. So I do recommend laminating. Fiberglass resin has gotten god awful expensive. I mean, we're talking like $200 and some a gallon. And that was the last time I bought it, and that was 15 months ago now. So Lord only knows where we're at now. Did that answer give you an idea?
Yeah, my other question, paired with that, is that, so I make sleds.
Great.
But I do all my sleds are tied.
Yeah.
They're all bound. And I got a sled from a guy in Nome named Phil Freismont. I don't know if you know him.
I've heard the name.
And it's a big freight sled, and I love that thing. People always look at it and go, "My God, it drives like a tank." And I'm like, "Yeah, but it's my tank." So anyway, it for how big it is, it just drives really nice. It's a 3-layer laminated runner, and what he ended up doing was taking eye bolts and drilling them all the way through all 3 sets of runners. And that's how he anchored. Everything else is mortise and tenon.
Right.
But that's how he anchored the stanchion onto the runner.
Okay.
And then the head of the bolt is just countersunk into that bottom layer of the runner.
And they're pretty thick layers. I think I've seen some of those. They're like 1/2 inch or something like that.
1/2 inch thick, 3 layers.
Yeah.
It drives like a bus, but I'm usually pulling, at the height of my season, I'm usually pulling anywhere between 1,200 and 1,700 pounds in a single sled load. So my question for you is, if you're trying to take the runner plastic material itself, which in my case is just bolted on cut strips of plastic, and trying to change that over to something that you can slide on a runner onto some sort of a dovetailed strip.
Stop right there. Stop, and here's the problem. There used to be a system for that. It was called the QCR, Quick Change Runner System. And what it was is it was a dovetailed aluminum rail that you screwed onto the bottom of your runner.
I heard about it.
And then there was a matching dovetail, and the plastic slid on. Again, it was one of those ideas that sounded really good on paper. The problem was a lot of people used 1/4 inch plastic with the dovetailed, which only left you about 1/8 of an inch, sometimes less, of plastic between that rail and the trail. People would run their plastic down and be just too lazy to change it. And so the rails would start to be worn down. The other thing is the rails, the ends of the dovetail would start, as we say, mushrooming in towards the runner, which made getting the plastic on and off really difficult. When you went through overflow sometimes and you got water in there, you got plastic popping off, usually at very inappropriate moments. Anytime plastic pops off and you're on the trail, it's an inappropriate moment. But yeah, that was just some of the bad things about that. The person who made that, Tim White, also makes the Matrix runners. And if anybody can get a hold of Tim, I've tried. Hans has tried. The rails just aren't available anymore. I think Dog Sled Central had plastic for regular QCR plastic yet, or I haven't really followed it much.
I've been able to find plastic to fit a metal runner, but therein comes the problem of, okay, how do you take a runner that's already, that thick, and then you're gonna take, just for sake of argument, say a Prairie Built Designs runner, which, itself is about so thick, and now you're gonna marry the two of them together, and now you got a runner that's that tall.
Right.
And that just doesn't seem like it's gonna drive well, or maybe it will, I don't know.
No, they generally don't.
Right, so what's the solution? I just get a huge sheet of ABS and cut it into strips and.
Essentially, that's what we've had to do at this point in time. The big tour sleds and things, again, to help mitigate that weight that we're talking about putting on the sleds, minimum 1/2 inch on the bottom. Linwood down there has not broken in a runner years, but his are 3 inches wide, 2 inches thick, and I put 3/4 inch UHMW on the bottom. Those babies are really bomb-proof, but they're also god-awful heavy. Some of the heaviest sleds that I build. I mean, we're talking 100+ pounds, just to roll them off of the bench. But yeah, at this point in time, there's really nothing you can do except go ahead and buy, strips of plastic and put it on. There's really no alternative. And how wide are your runners?
1.75 inches.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you probably want to run 2-inch plastic on there anyways to give you that little buffer. But
And is it better to use, all those pre-made runner plastics are they're not a UHMW fiber laced. They're more of a clear plastic.
Right.
Is it better to use a clear plastic versus a UHMW, or?
I would say for overall, I go with the UHMW. The newer plastics, it's kind of like the emperor's new clothes. And I always tell the story, you're in your shop, I'm in the shop. It's after the Iditarod. People are bringing sleds in for the end of the season. So, okay, I'll just say these are top 20 mushers, okay? I won't name names. So top 20 musher A comes in and he says, yeah, Dave, man, a lot of grit crap on the snow in Shaktoolik. So I switched from yellow plastic to blue plastic. And man, I just took off. It's like grease lightning. Oh, right. Top 20 musher B comes in the next day. He says, yeah, boy, it was really bad in Shaktoolik. Yeah, I switched from blue plastic to yellow plastic. And man, I just, oh, really? Oh, great. So you understand, it could be the fact they switched to new plastic. The plastics have gotten so crazy, they're like 5-degree increments. Do you think you come down off of the hill, drop onto the river, and it's 15 degrees colder? Oh boy, I gotta switch from orange to gray here. No, people don't do that. They get into a checkpoint, they look and see how tore up their plastic is, they see the kind of terrain that they're coming across. and they deal with it that way. But no, your UHMW is still probably the best overall plastic out there to put on. You have white and you got black. The black is a little bit softer, even though they say they're absolutely the same. Just the fact of, I run miles of the stuff through the saw. I can tell the difference in them. I can just tell the difference in the way it goes down the trail. Kind of depends on what, are you a musher who goes out when it's 25, 30, 40 below? Then I would say go with the white.
And I'm on the black right now, which might explain why I'm having problems.
Yeah. So, that's it. You've got to just work with what we've got. And again, the fancier the sleds get, the harder they are to fix, the harder they are to drive. I think I mentioned earlier, my Mount Rushmore of mushers. From a sled builder, sled driver's standpoint, Lance Mackey is right there at the peak. He broke a sled on the Iditarod. I think it was the first Iditarod he won. And he had to ride this sled 100 miles before he could get a replacement sled. Tanya brought that sled to me in the shop. I couldn't have driven that sled 40 feet, much less 100 miles. And I doubt if anybody in this room, I'd put $100 bill down on the table and say, okay, drive this sled 100 miles. There was no runner on one side, on the right side, past the rear stanchion. What he had done in typical Lance fashion is get a screw gun and screwed his footboard up from a piece of plastic. So he had a footboard kind of on this piece of plastic that just kind of went all over. And he stood on that left runner and drove that thing with an Iditarod team and won. Just saying. Not everybody could have done that. But that was Lance. I knew Lance, and he was the kind of guy who he looked at life as a series of situations, not as a series of problems. So for him, it was just, well, that's unfortunate. Because conversely, the bad thing about metal runners is I have more than two handfuls of people who have failed to finish a race because they've broken a runner. The end of the runner has come off, say on the Cusco or the Tustamina or something. You're 50 miles from the finish line and all of a sudden you don't have 3 feet of runner. Most people can't drive that sled and they just have to quit. That has been, we again, when you work with metal runners, I communicate a lot with other sled builders. So we all try to copy what everybody else is doing. If somebody comes up with a good idea, flattery is, we just, oh, look, Dave's doing that. I used to do that. So I talked to Hans a lot, Hans Gott in Whitehorse. And, over the years, we've tried to reinforce those metal runners, insert plastic in that upper track to try to mitigate that. Remember, if you're building a sled on those runners, you've got to keep the profile that you're bolting down on the runner really small. Don't take a 3-foot chunk of aluminum and bolt it down. That was tried at the beginning. That did not work out real well. You've got it, because the metal runners, again, they vibrate. Force flows through them differently than it does wood. And if you block that force, the force has to be released at places. And it was amazing how quickly some people broke brand new runners. Jerry Riley is the only musher I know to break a set of matrix runners within 100 miles. That's the record. And the other thing is they're incredibly expensive. I'm personally not particularly fond of prairie built runners. There, I feel like I'm in a group again. It's nothing personal. They're wonderful people. Hans and I have talked about this. Hans and I have both built sleds on prairie built runners, so it's not like we've not used them. Our preferred runner is the Tim White Matrix runners. The Matrix distance runners have a lower profile and the material is heavier, and it just seems to be a better extrusion. We're not sure if that tall profile on the prairie built runners has caused some issues, but I have to say that over the years, I've seen more broken prairie built runners than matrix runners. So, but they are also pretty much the last people standing in the game. So I understand that you know, if you want metal runners right now, this is what we've got to deal with. I keep hoping that somebody down in Tim White land in Minnesota decides to start producing this stuff again. It's hard to say. I'm surprised the Europeans haven't come up with something yet, but that is probably pretty close, would be my guess. Yes.
So I have a question about bar brake attachment. I've had two, now I run prairie builds, but in the past I've had two wooden sleds. The one builder, Kenny has Northwind sleds. His bar brake attaches to the rear stanchion. Both these sleds were rear stanchion sleds. Right. The other one, Jack Beckstrom, Adnac, he had angle iron.
Right, little bracket.
Yep, little bracket that it's separate, so there's no, the bar brake isn't attached to the rear stanchion. The rear stanchion is by itself. What's your thoughts on which one's ideal? I
prefer not having my brake attached to the rear stanchions. I like keeping that whole thing separate. And in some cases, we like to run our bridle off of a point that might be attached to that brake bracket too. And that works well. I don't like attaching, especially things like brakes that can suddenly stop and break things.
I've broken that stanchion.
Yeah.
Probably why, because that's where it broke.
Right.
Bolt there.
Yeah.
It cracked right up. It was laminated stanchion.
Yeah.
So it stayed together. And
Yeah, you can.
It,
but no, the separating the brake out to a separate bracket is always your best bet if you can.
And having it's a pretty decent length of angle iron.
Okay.
Because it's wood, that's okay, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. But you really don't need much there. It depends on how you're going to attach it. On some basket sleds, you've got eye bolts that are coming up that you're tying your stanchions into anyways. So you can remove those, drill matching holes, put a piece of angle there. Now I prefer aluminum angle for brake brackets. You don't need to go with steel on that. I'm going to back up for a minute here. For these big tour sleds, we found out that we were ovaling 3/16 6000 series aluminum. So what I use now is 3/16 stainless steel there. But for most, you can get away with even eighth inch or 3/16 inch aluminum angle. And it's not that hard to cut. You get yourself a little chunk of 2-inch or 1.5 inches and just bolt it in. But yeah, try to keep it separate. And you might be able to rework those other sleds, move that brake up a little bit to get it off of those stanchions. The other thing is maybe put in a plastic gusset there, a little piece of UHMW between the brake and the stanchion to give it a little bit more stability there too. You could try that.
That's what Prairieville does, because they have it attached to that metal, it's not really a stanchion. It's
Right.
like the Easy Riders.
Yeah.
But it's like a half stanchion.
Yeah.
And they have those little gussets, I guess.
Mhm. That works out too. So they're attaching their brake to that back block system rather than having a separate, okay. They've evolved and a lot of their stuff has changed over the years too.
Yeah, and the ones I have are probably pushing 20 years old.
Okay.
The one was Sunny Linders.
Oh,
And
funny.
the other one I got, I can't remember now, Musher, who did like Canadian Challenge in Alberta. I can't remember, it was maybe Bob or something.
Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, Bob.
Oh, Bob something, yeah, I remember him. The car acts, right?
That's, I think, over 20 years old now too, so.
No, I mean, there's a lot of good sleds out there. I mean, I've certainly seen a lot of good used sleds, kicking around. But like I said, people need to pay attention. I hate to say it, but new sleds, especially, I look at the prices, and they're kind of like RVs. You drive them off at a lot, and the price drops in half. Just saying, I had old editor, one of the editors of Mushing magazine wanted to build a metal runner race sled. So he spent some time in the shop and did it. And I'm not going to say how much it cost him, but let's just say when he got the sled done, he was kind of like, is this it? Is this how much money I really got into the sled? And the biggest thing was the $400 pair of runners at the time. But when you kind of back off of the sled and you look at actually what's in it, there's not a lot there. There's a lot of knowledge of how to put things together. But material-wise, there's an amazingly small amount sometimes. Just saying. When I see things for $5,000, I'm like, really? You pay $5,000 for that? Okay. Honey, I think we need to raise our prices. Yeah.
So just an anecdote, my main sled is a free-laughing husky Dave Klumb sled, so we're talking late 80s, early 90s. I don't race and I don't do long distance stuff, but that sled is absolutely solid. It has gotten banged around in many ways, and I don't drive big teams. When I told Joe May about the sled, I don't know if I told you this, but I told Joe May about the sled one time. He's like, "Oh yeah, I bet that thing is solid." He said, "I bet it's built like a brick shit house."
Yeah, Joe, I like Joe. Joe May, Father Mark May, local veterinarian. I did a rodder. He was one of these tinkerers. He loved tinkering with sleds. And I've never been able to quite duplicate it. He had come up with this neat locking system for his brake. So he didn't carry a snow hook. He was able to put his brake down and had this rod that essentially came down, held the brake down, and kind of clipped in. And so he could go off and do everything with his team and come back. And it was just really a great little system there. I always admired that. It was it's like, wow, Joe, that was really great. But again, it was one of those things that if the dogs jerked real hard, it would pop up. And he told me more than once. He cursed the thing as he was walking down the trail. Because unlike Spirit of the Wind, the teams never seem to turn around. Has anybody noticed that? When you whistle and call them, it's like, oh, bye. That's happened to me. Yeah.
I know now we rely a lot more on bolts and stuff, but I was wondering if you could give some pro tips on lashing.
Oh,
If
sure.
you're out on the trail and whatnot, having some line to fix or make repairs or whatever. And I know a lot of times people still today like lashing because it provides a lot more flex.
Oh, absolutely. You are absolutely correct.
I was wondering if you might give some pro tips.
My favorite sled, and I should have brought it tonight, is a 4-foot lash basket. All lashed together, no bolts except, holding things in the runners, eye bolts. I was going to mention this, and again, it's not prejudiced on materials, but having been around sleds all the years that I have, I would put a new, well-built birch sprint sled up against anything that's carbon fiber, Eurocentric, any fancy sled. Birch has an amazing ability to bend and stretch, especially when it's, fairly fresh. The problem with birch is it breaks down quickly. But I don't think even the new carbon fiber sleds have had the full flexibility and drivability that some of the old native made, especially birch sleds did. And you're absolutely right. I still love driving a tied sled. And accordingly, you should always in your kit have some extra twine. It's amazing. What I usually do is have a couple of these in the sled and I tie a bowline on the end. And that gives me a loop so that out on the trail, I don't have to be thinking about doing things like this when my hands are cold. So you get that nice loop in there. And then, like I said, you've got a lash sled, a broken stanchion or something. You can walk off on the side of the trail, get yourself a chunk of willow, pretty much anything, pull that stanchion together, wrap this thing around, and head back down the trail. As far as how tight and how loose your sled should be, that's almost a personal taste thing. But overall, the smaller the sled, the more flexible you want it. The bigger the sled, like the big wooden tied freight sleds, you especially want to be tying the front ends of those sleds as tight as you can, because you're putting weight in there. And what weight does to sleds is it wants to flex runners out. And as soon as you start flexing things out, those things really start driving badly. So especially on the big freight sleds, tie your fronts real solid. And golly, I wish maybe we got to do a sled tying program.
Yeah.
We used to do when we had the symposiums, we did a lot of sled tying demonstrations. Because there's a lot of different ways to tie a sled, again, depending on what you're using that sled for. When you're putting the cross pieces in on a mortise and tenon, if you don't want those front stanchions to flex out, well, then you might want to bring down some extra line there on the lower end of that stanchion. And there's a way to do it that you kind of weave back and forth out of your tie hole there. So I think we need to definitely schedule a tying demonstration.
You can come back tomorrow night.
The hall open? Yeah. We'll make it happen.
Is there any specific area you'd like to know about tying? Because everything has its own little quirks.
Yeah, I'd love to attend that class, but one thing I was thinking about in particular is, say you're making a repair and you're going to try and repair it with lashing.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to wrap it around a bunch of times. How might you tie that off? Hold it tight.
That's the other nice thing about this knot. If you could wrap it around and then come back and get around that original knot, or there's a little loop there that you can loop back into. You don't necessarily need a fid, but if you've got a small piece of metal or something that you can kind of spread the line with and feed it through and do some half hitches, you're in business. I know we had a sled, beginner sled, I think, that we broke a stanchion and tied a chunk of axe handle on. It was such a good repair. I think it went 4 or 5 years until we finally decided to sell the sled, and I had to put a new stanchion on because I'm a sled builder. Yeah, it was a great repair. And it was the neck of the axe too, so you could really see it was an axe handle. But yeah, repairs, that's the nice thing about wooden tied sleds. They really are forgiving. You can get away with a lot on those as compared to bolt together sleds. That's the nice thing about them. But the more tying you can do on a basket sled, the more flexible it's going to be. So even the basket slats, if you can avoid screwing those into the cross piece, if you can just do a cross tie there, the same with on your headboard, if you can just tie that stuff all in, every tie adds to the flexibility of that sled. And they are just a joy to drive. I must admit, I just love driving them.
I have trouble with my snow hook.
Okay, everybody does.
Oh.
There's not a good place to put a snow hook. It's the most
Right.
dangerous thing that we have on the sled. If you've got a bag on and you want it in the front, it always seems to be interfering with the bag. If you have them sticking out on the sides, which is a great idea if your sled falls down, then they hook in. But of course, you're going down with knives sticking out of the side of the sled
Right.
too. Of course, then we have the castration position as we call it, where we all know. It's like, oh yeah, I'm driving the sled. So it's there's really no good. I mean, the sprint mushers have it easy. They just put a couple of them up there, and they don't have to worry about going through the trees. Generally, though, people put them somewhere facing forward inside the sled.
Right.
That's about the best you can do. If you don't have any place for a hook holder, you can just tie a rope and kind of hook them in there. But they're a pain. I mean, really, they are.
Yeah.
You need them, and when you really need them, they're really important. But 90% of the time, it's just an accident waiting to happen. Oh, yeah.
So, about, I don't know, 2 months ago, an elder actually showed me something he used to do on the trap line, and it sort of fixes that whole problem. It works magnificently. And you take moose rawhide, which, is not exactly the easiest thing in the world to get, but anyway, and you sort of cut it out in this shape about like that and about that long, and you wet it and you mold it sort of into form around the snow hook itself, and you let it dry on the snow hook. And the back end of it has got sort of 2 straps that you could put around a bar that would go between your handle, anywhere in that column of space that's most efficient. And if you pierce a hole, then if the hook is hooked towards me and the straps are on that bar, and you drill a hole or pierce a hole at the bottom of that thing, and then tie it onto that rear cross piece that's spanning your 2 runners. So when you pull that hook out, the end of that thing doesn't just lift up and you can't actually pull it out. The traction of the moose keeps it in place.
Oh, nice.
But it's rawhide.
Okay.
And so pushing up against that metal repeatedly, it'll get slick. It'll get smooth.
People, back in the day, people would cut off boots. It was pretty much the same thing. You'd see people going down the trail with the top of a cowboy boot. Basically it was about the same thing.
And it just works fantastic.
Huh, that's very neat.
It works fantastic.
Kind of old school there again.
Yeah, I have a much simpler question than these other ones, but I'm curious about any tips about restoring really old weathered wood on a sled in terms of how would you give it a little bit extra life, and so that when it crashes into something, it doesn't instantly splinter.
I get a lot of that. I call them gray wood sleds.
Yeah.
They've just been left out a few too many seasons. It depends on how much you really want to get into it. If the ties are bad, I often tell people just untie the whole thing, take it down to parts, start over. 60 grit sandpaper, kind of take that gray, a little bit of that gray off. And then any kind of a decent exterior deck oil or siding oil. Or failing that, boiled linseed oil works really good too. That's pretty much old school there, but it works just fine. Again, sitting up on the hill and not getting out much, I failed to realize that they no longer sell 5-gallon buckets of oil-based finishes anymore. It's all water-based finish. Water-based finish is about the most worthless thing on the face of the earth other than nipples on men. It has no purpose, and I just used some recently so I can speak from matter of experience. It's like, my God, it's terrible. So find yourself like a Thompson's, a Bear. For years, I used a product called Super Deck, which is very good. But you want an oil-based finish. You don't want to be fooling around with water-based finishes on these things.
Yeah, the ties still seem pretty good.
Then I would just, get yourself a sanding block, for instance. These soft sanding blocks work real well. And they might be like a 60 grit on one side and 120 on the other. And that's nice. Just slowly, very carefully avoid the ties as much as you can and take that down. And then my experience is they're going to suck that oil like a drunken sailor, quite honestly. They're going to go through a lot. You're probably going to end up putting 3-4 coats, pretty serious coats on that. But that usually brings it back. You let that oil soak in and the color comes back out. It's pretty nice.
Cool. Thank you.
She was up there earlier.
Another tying question for like a kit to carry with us in case we need to do repairs. Is there a particular kind of line that you recommend for lashing?
For most of the sleds, I use a braided nylon line rather than a twisted nylon line. And the reason is the twisted stuff, as you wind it, it starts to continue to twist. It becomes really tough to work with. This is essentially a commercial fishing line. I know Cold Spot sells it. Like I said, number 18 is a nice size to work with. It will hold anything that you are doing. If you're really paranoid, you can go with something bigger. This is like a 40 or a 42 or something. But anything like that, an 18, a 22, 24, just a nice, and I'd say have some like 4-foot chunks with a loop on them. Sometimes you don't need much. Just a couple of those in your repair kit though can really save you some trouble later on.
So most of my experience is in ski drawing, and I just inherited a kick sled.
Okay.
But it is so damn hard to drive, and I don't know if it's just because it's a kick sled, or I know physics are against me because it's light. But is there any sort of modification that could help a kick sled?
Is it a Euro kick sled or is it one of my old ones?
It's one of your old ones.
Okay. Then it should be driving perfectly. No, the kick sleds in particular can be a little goofy there. How many dogs have you got pulling it?
Right now it's just 2.
Okay. And what's it doing?
So if you're standing on the right runner, the front is going in the left and the opposite direction.
Okay.
So it's kind of, I know a family member looked at it, it was almost as if like the toes at the end of the runners were kind of out. Maybe if it came in a little bit, it could
That's
help.
usually, usually the toes should be in.
Yeah.
On that. And when I put those plastic headboards in, there should be a tow in on that.
Okay.
But if you'd like to have me take a look at it sometime, I'd be more than happy to. The other thing you might want to check is your bridle. Sometimes if the bridle gets a little off center, that can cause a problem too. But some of those kick sleds, they weren't meant to really go fast either.
Or if the trail's like even slightly at an angle, it's like you're kind of
Okay,
downhill from it. For me, at
it
least.
slides too well.
Yes.
Okay. What color plastic?
Pink.
Red, okay. Some of the plastics act differently. Okay, but yeah, why don't you give me a call sometime? Where are you at in the valley here?
I hope I'm older.
Or? Okay. Well, we're out here in Goldstream. Sometime feel free to give me a holler. And be more than happy to take a look at it. Because sometimes it could be just something like that. Maybe we need to pull that front end in a little bit more. We can do that. Yes.
So I'm working on a sled right now, and it does have metal runners. Everything was bolted, stanchions are bolted, of course, through, and then plastics up top, and then again bolted. And I kind of came in a little late, so I didn't hear what you were saying about that. But what do I need to be aware of thinking about, metal runners and this new wood that we just put on it and those bolts? Is there anything I need to be aware of?
So you've got your stanchions are wood. L brackets or U brackets that are holding it on. And then you've got the raised bed up on, bolted up. There's, pretty much past that, you're okay to go. The big thing is it depends on how you drive these things. And some people I know have put 20,000 miles on a pair of metal runners, and they're still just chucking down the trail. Other people, barely get 1,000 or a couple thousand miles on them, and they've got to replace them. So it's more of, your driving and what you're comfortable with. But I think I'm happy to hear this, and I'm getting a little bit more of this feedback. I'm really happy that people are building sleds again. Because part of mushing is really understanding the equipment that you're working with. And when you just are buying stuff and it's coming in, you don't really have a feel for what you're on. And I think when people build sleds, and make mistakes, we all make mistakes in building sleds, but you learn really quickly from that. And I've learned a ton of stuff from mistakes, and I'd be the first one to admit that. There have been some sleds I've made, it's like, oh boy, and then show back up. But there always seems to be somebody out there who loves them. It's like, wow, you really like that sled, huh? Great. I saw another hand up somewhere, or was that just the baby?
It's me again.
That's okay.
So I run by about, might be a little later this year because I'm sort of behind the mark. By about Christmas, New Year's, I'm usually running anywhere between 1,100 and 1,400 pounds per sled load.
Okay, excuse me. What are you carrying?
I'm carrying gear for scientists, lodges.
Oh, okay, cool.
Whoever needs whatever needs whenever.
Oh, no. It's freight, not humans.
Yeah, no, it's freight. It's strapped down. It's strapped down. And my sled is a 8-foot bed.
Okay.
With a 1.5-foot brush bow, and then I got 3 feet of runner behind that. So I'm coming up on 14 feet in a hurry.
Yeah.
Totally, from runner to brush bow. And that's the biggest sled. And then I got one that's a little smaller than that was built on the coast in Nome by Phil. And I like the biggest one, and I like the one that Phil built, but I'm finding that when I'm carrying things that it's not contributing to the weight necessarily, but there's a lot of bulk, there's a lot of mass, and I don't like running a high load that's real high in the front. It's just as high in the front as it is in the back, and I don't really like that for stability's sake. At what point in terms of length of sled, I'm running on rivers and creeks and I'm not having to deal with trees. Occasional rock, but not trees. At what point in terms of the length am I going to just find it to be a completely and entirely unmanageable brick?
Here's the kind of the issue with, and I need to get a couple of questions answered here. Are they rock runners or straight runners or flat runners?
What do you mean by that?
Do the runners like a rocking chair?
Oh, they're not rock runners, they're straight flat.
They're straight flat, okay. That is going to be an issue. And if you look back at a lot of the big old traditional freight sleds, they had what was known as rocked runners.
Right.
And they didn't have much runner behind the rear stanchion.
Right.
Because the concept of somebody just standing behind the sled and riding down the trail was pretty much of a late development in this. Most of the people with a big sled like yours would be normally run by two people. One in the back who was pushing, and he would bounce down on the handles, and it wouldn't be a round handle, it would be handle on either side. And with the rocked runners, that was pushing the front of the sled up. The second person would be up on the G-pole, pulling the front of the sled up. The difference that we're dealing with now is, my guess is you're still going down the trail at maybe 3-4 miles an hour, something like that.
5 to 6 miles an hour, and if I get bogged down, I still got to buckle load and pop it out.
But you see, at 4 or 5 miles an hour, you're going 4 to 5 times faster than the people who were originally driving those sleds back in the day. And that's kind of what's happening with the flat runners. There is going to be a time when there's just too much weight on that sled that you're not going to be able to maneuver it decently. And that's just a matter of physics at that point. And that's where the big rock runners come in. Joe Runyon had built some beautiful, beautiful, big freight. Kathy's got one. I actually, Dave Sawatsky had one, and I had it for a while, and built Jeff King and a couple other people the same sled. You know, the big rock runners on those puppies. And in the case of Jeff, I actually put steel on the bottom too.
And that was manageable to drive with one person.
Yeah.
Okay.
But again, it's a whole different style of driving. It's physical. Let's put it that way. You're working out there. That hauling that stuff down the trail was just,
It takes me probably 9 to 14 hours of trail time, not actively running the dogs, but trail time, including rests, for me to get 15 to 18 miles from where I'm parked to where I need to get all that weight. And I'm running 7 to 11 dogs.
Okay.
So they're pulling in excess of 100 to 125% of the body weight. And they have no problem with that because they are what they are. They're old time freight runners.
Yeah, but like I said, that's kind of, you're going to run into at some point a point of no return.
Right.
On the weight on that sled.
But in terms of length, from an 8-foot bed to a 9-foot bed, if I put a rock runner on it, am I going to notice the difference between, say, an 8-foot bed with a flat runner and a 9-foot bed with a rock runner?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you would certainly notice the difference. Again, it's a whole different ballgame as far as driving. There's really nice sleds, those big ones, those big old freight sleds, and a lot of people tried to do tours with them, and they're actually not real good for tours because you got to slide people back in between because you got the long stanchions on either side. But yeah, they're things of beauty. And again, just as a side note, I've been absolutely ecstatic to see some of the natives in the villages. They'll call me up and they say, "Oh, we need some plastic for a sled," and I'll say, "Oh, send me a picture." Oh man, there's just some beautiful, beautiful pieces of work being done again in the village, and that is so positive because that was something that was disappearing really quickly around here. And I'm just so happy to see that there's that focus on it again.
Dave, what are your suggestions for drags to get them when you're going up a hill to safely get it up so that you can run behind?
Okay, so that's the number 2 pain in the button piece on your sled. When you want the things, they're great, but when you don't want them, what do you do with this chunk of snow machine track? Which is probably the heaviest thing on your sled to begin with. I've been shifting more to what I call a floating drag, where you try to bungee it up so it rides a little bit above ground, above the snow. The problem with that is even with the Arctic bungee, and when it gets cold, after about the 3rd day, that thing is back flat on the ground again. You can kind of put a bungee on it and one of those adjustable buckles and keep adjusting it up. For the tour sleds and a lot of the other sleds, we just put flip ups, so that when you do go uphill, you can just reach down, pull the thing up and slap it up. But again, there's a lot of things happening in the back end of the sled here. You've got this drag, you've got a brake, you've got this snow hook and your cookies and coffee and all these important things, and they're all in your way. So there's really no good way, but if you can take some bungee, like I said, maybe try to keep it flexed up a little bit more, that's good. Cecilia?
I have one of your floating tracks, and it's the best thing ever. It's fabulous, it does weigh more for sure, but it is by far the easiest way to get that thing out of the way. And because it's stiffer, it's much more easy to keep it up.
Yeah.
Than something that's on a rope or something. Fabulous, so you still can't really run behind it, you still have to pick it up. But I've even just leaned it against my knees, even when I didn't have to hook it, and was still able to kick and help and whatever. So Bill, if you ever want to look at it, I'm happy to show it to you, it's fabulous.
Thank you.
Reminds me, Bill, I've got some brackets for you.
Finally.
Yeah, I'm looking at that chunk of aluminum. Oh, yeah, that's right. But yeah, drags are one of those things that I must admit I resisted for a long time, and probably the arthritis in my foot is the offshoot of that, because I always wore big bunny boots or something and just used that as a drag. And I wouldn't recommend that. But we were on the Serum Run, and I left Ruby, and you got that steep run down to the river. And it was the first time in my life that I was like, oh, so that's what this thing does. Boy, that's really good. It really does have a use, but yeah, I agree. It's in my way half of the time, and especially we mush a lot down in the Chattanooga Valley where you've got a lot of little hills, and you end up putting the thing up, taking it down, putting it up and taking it down. It's just a pain. Yes, sir.
So, comment to Cole, when I follow up to Cole's thing about hauling the big heavy loads. We started moving the majority of our weight, really big, heavy loads, into a signaling, actually, front of the dogs, so it's tied into the gang. That works really well to move hundreds of pounds. So how we stock a lot of our dog food. In remote places, we can, 8, 10, 12 bags of food stuffed in there. Makes it easier to manage the load for the dogs to pull it, and then also like for the humans to move it around when it goes off the trail. wrapped up like a burrito. It can kind of flip and spin and bounce off the trees, and we don't lose anything. So I know like the easiest thing is build the sled bigger, but we actually took that weight and moved it out of the sled and put it in between, and it just adds an extra section of gang line.
That's a good idea. I know other people have been doing the exact same thing for hauling their dog food and their loads up off of the Yukon.
Very forgiving and way easier to move when it goes smooth.
That is really funny. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about moving the freight. The day of the G-pole is pretty much gone. I haven't seen anybody requesting a G-pole on a sled for at least 10, 15 years now. But they had a use. And I think we've got to realize that, if you're moving that kind of weight, the front end of that sled is going to want to bog down. That's always the problem. And that's why you have that person up there lifting that. One of the neat little additions they had to that is they actually ran a board that was attached to the gangline that was behind the dog. So that person running the G-pole could stand on that board, actually do a lifting and still go down the trail. Which sounds pretty exciting to me, actually, on one level. We could make it a new Olympic sport. G-polling.
But at 1 mile an hour as opposed to.
Oh, did you see going 15, 20 miles an hour like that?
Any more questions?
But we should definitely do a sled tying.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've forgotten just how much people really like that.
Yeah. Well, I just received a verbal okay tonight from Todd Shellick, the president of ADMA, and he said we could do a little FID class here, and we could incorporate it and maybe do a couple separate workshops.
Oh, sure.
So with the holidays coming, it's getting a little harder to get the hall, but
No problem, we can do this.
yeah. And if anyone's interested in coming to future events, if you sign in over there, or you can email me at education@alaskadogmushers.com, and we'll make sure you know about all the future events. So, yeah. Thank you
This
so
was
much.
really informative, thanks.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank
just
you.
love talking about dog sleds.
Thank you.
As you probably guessed. Hi, my name is David.
All right. Thank you so much.
Just again to pass on